Anyways, it's 9 o'clock here in DC, so it's time to start our virtual session, How to Raise Ambition Through Carbon Offsetting, Lessons Learned and Post-2020 Prospects. So we just had a live poll that we hope you saw and participated. Please let us know which country and which sector you're joining us from. Please submit your questions using the WebEx Q&A panel and view the chat panel for helpful information on carbon offsets from our hosts and our panelists. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available on the I4C website shortly. If you're sharing on social media, please use the hashtag Innovate for Climate and the hashtag Carbon Offsets. We're going to start with our moderator, Christoph Ahrens, who unfortunately will not be using his camera, but we'll be able to hear him. And Dr. Maria Carvalho from South Pole and Nicholas, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your last name, Krabich, we should have rehearsed this, from the Wuppertal Institute. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that we can get started.
Okay, right. Thank you, Isabel. Can you hear me all right? Okay, thanks. Yeah, also a very warm welcome from my side. I'm the moderator, Christoph Ahrens from Wuppertal Institute. Unfortunately, due to inexplicable technical errors, you can't see my camera and myself. So I'm going to try to run you through this show without you seeing me. Today, we're going to look at the role that carbon markets play in both domestic schemes as well as internationally. And we'll start with two presentations from colleagues of South Pole and Wuppertal Institute, which are based on findings from an ongoing research project. We will then have a panel discussion with our distinguished panelists, which I'm going to introduce in a second, followed by a Q&A session, and finally a short wrap-up summarizing the key takeaways for you. Now, this brings me to the lineup of our speakers and discussants. We first have the presentations by Maria Carvalho, consultant at South Pole, and Nico Krabich, researcher at Wuppertal Institute. As discussants, we have today Judy Meltzer, Director General at the Carbon Markets Bureau of the Government of Canada. Then we have Felipe de Leon, advisor in the Climate Change Directorate of the Ministry of Environment in Costa Rica, as well as Martin Heschen of DG Climate Action of the European Commission, who replaces Beatrice Jordi today, who couldn't make it. At the end, we will have a short input from Carsten Kaschunke of the German Environment Agency, UBA, I guess who is still tuning in at the moment. Now, first of all, a very warm welcome to the panelists and to the presenters from my side. Thank you very much for joining us today. And then, without further ado, we're going to turn to our presenters now, Maria and Nico, who are going to present interim findings from a current UBA project on the future role of offsetting. They're going to look at lessons from pre-2020, and as well as post-2020 factors for success of offsetting systems. We'll start with Maria's input. So Maria, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining. We're really excited to present our findings on discussing the role of offsets in compliance, both lessons that we've learned pre-2020, and then Nico will discuss about post-2020 factors for success on how offsets can be used in the future. Could we go to the next slide? So what I'm going to present is actually the first that is part of an ongoing research project that we're doing with the German Environmental Agency in looking at the role of offsets to address hard-to-abate sectors in the post-2020 world. But part of that is then thinking about what have we learned? We've had about over 20 years of offset use, and it's a way of thinking about what are the key lessons. And in thinking about that, the whole point is actually what can offsets provide in terms of adding value to compliance schemes, but also ensuring that it upholds environmental integrity. And The way we thought about that in terms of adding value, there were key indicators that we were focusing on when doing the case study analysis for the EU, Alberta, Australia, Japan, and Colombia. And these were specifically chosen as case study analysis to do deep dives because of the wide breadth of characteristics and even their performance. So in looking at that, we thought about to what extent did the incorporation of offsets help in terms of accepting and raising ambition of the compliance scheme to go through the political process? To what extent did it actually provide policymakers with flexibility to reduce emissions outside of the compliance scheme? And then also, to what extent did it achieve sustainable development co-benefits? Alternatively, though, as much as there's exciting things of how offsets can add value to a compliance scheme, it could also potentially undermine environmental integrity. And so what were the ways in which we thought offsets could have ensured that it avoided that by actually representing real, measurable, verifiable, and additional and permanent emission reductions? And then also the use of offsets didn't create a perverse incentive in terms of deterring stronger climate action. So one thing I'll say before going on to the results is that we really would like to thank the German Environmental Agency. They've been so helpful in being able to look through these analysis, understand the case studies, and to draw out those key lessons. And it's been a very fruitful collaboration also with Wuppertal Institute, because as you can see, this consortium of researchers is from different perspectives, going into looking at policymakers, compliance actors, offset suppliers, and also the political economy. And when we think about evaluating offset, it has to be within that broader political and economic context, which is really coming through the case studies. We can go to the next slide. So what are the key conditions that seem to come up when we're doing this case study analysis to add value and uphold environmental integrity? And when I think about this, this is what offsets, this needs to be the base. Otherwise, offsets will not actually provide a lot of the indicators of success that we were thinking of. The first one is actually the compliance scheme itself has to be strong and a bit ambitious. So offsets generally are seen as being useful and politically justified when the compliance scheme itself is perceived as having is perceived to potentially create certain risks in terms of negative economic effects, risk of carbon leakage, and therefore you would need a cost containment measure. And therefore, in this case, it's the political justification in the broader political economy context. Now, one way to counteract that is to do economic modeling. But the other part is when the offset is actually in place, what we find is that it's equally important that the scheme is strong. It sends a strong carbon price signal. Otherwise, if it doesn't, offsets aren't used. So not only do you need the strong and ambitious compliance scheme has to not only be ambitious during the introduction of it, it should make sure that it maintains that ambition and a strong carbon price signal that leads actors to want to reduce their own emissions in the long term, but also use offsets as a short-term cost containment measure. If not, what has actually been seen is that offsets are one of the least used instruments when the compliance signal is actually really low, because it's just easier to pay the carbon price or meet the underlying compliance target if it's not ambitious. On the other side is also the importance of having a robust governance and infrastructure. And this is incredibly important, that normally we've seen in some case studies that the governance and infrastructure around offsets are actually done after the compliance scheme. And without this clarity in institutions and institutional alignment, you can have strong risk of environmental integrity not being held, and really the easiest projects going through, which could have questionable environmental integrity, rather than the best projects that uphold to it, and actually ensuring that to have that trust that these projects, through the robust and governance and infrastructure system, are there. And the second thing that's equally important is that to mitigate delivery risk. Offsets can only add that kind of value and drive emission reductions in projects where there could be high sustainable co-benefits. You need to make sure that the infrastructure for delivery is in place, the governance capacities are in place to enable that. Without that, Buyers wouldn't be interested because it's risky as a compliance measure. And then a lot of the benefits in terms of sustainable development and driving emission reductions outside of the compliance scheme would not be realized. So these are the two key conditions that should be considered if policymakers are considering using offsets as part of their compliance scheme. And with that, I'll pass it over to Nico.
Well, thank you, Maria, for presenting these key findings of the pre-2020 analysis. I will now jump to the second part of the UBA project, of the UBA research project, and where we looked into the circumstances for offsetting under Paris. So here we identified a key, you could say, paradigm shift or fundamental change in terms, if you compare the pre-2020 with the post-2020 circumstances, which is the Paris paradigm shift, which introduced really a transformative ambition into climate policy. So it did so by establishing clear and ambitious long-term targets. And these objectives, they require fundamental changes in our economies. And these long-term targets, they also provide the basis for all climate-related activities. So this also, of course, includes offsets. The second key fundamental change introduced with the Paris Agreement, as you all know, is its universal scope. So yeah, the Paris Agreement requires all countries to develop and communicate NDCs, and all countries must implement actions that are intended to achieve these targets. So under these circumstances, there is these circumstances provide the basis for really rethinking the role of offsets. And that's what we did in the project. We explored three overarching questions. The first one being, what are the overarching principles offsets must uphold to? What are sectors where offset use should be allowed, and where should offsets be generated? So always looking at both sides of an offset program, the offset use side and the offset generation side, so demand and supply side. And closely related to this last point, there's another question about the design of offset programs post-2020. So on the next slide, next slide, please. Yeah, what you really can say, the key question we explored was the principles. What are the overarching principles, as I said? And in the past, the focus was really predominantly on ensuring environmental integrity. So it was environmental integrity, ensuring that the use of offsets would ensure a zero-sum game. And also to a certain extent, there was, for international offsets in particular, the aspect of sustainable development, as Maria has outlined already. Now, with the Paris Agreement, there is another key principle, which is ambition and ambition raising. And this ambition raising principle is not only justified by the paradigm shift introduced earlier with this new ambition of the Paris Agreement, but also with Article 6.1, which explicitly states that a voluntary cooperation under Article 6 is to allow parties to raise their ambition. So you could really say that these are the main principles we have identified. And the next question we asked was, how do these principles relate to the conditions on the ground where offsets are generated and used? And here we have identified a large number of these factors, and we looked into the relationship between these success factors and the principles. And you can say that these factors and the relationship, how they impact the principles, they can inform the sectoral scope and the design of the offset program. Well, on the next slide, you can see an example of how we did this, using the example of success factors for ambition raising. And here, as I said, again, we always look at both sides of the offset program, the demand side, the supply side, so the offset use side and the offset generation side. And what we have identified for the offset use side is that mitigation costs is a key parameter here, key success factor. They should be high, and closely related to that, there should also be a strong carbon leakage risk. So there should be a certain risk of dislocation of economic activities if the carbon price is increased. At the same time, the technical mitigation potential should be low. So there should ideally be no abatement. There should be only unabatable emissions left. So these and other parameters or success factors are relevant for deciding on how to, on whether an offset approach should be, or the offset use should be allowed for a certain sector. And of course, they could also, in doing so, also inform the design. Yeah, on the offset generation side, so the offset supply side, here we would, of course, look at sectors with a significant technical mitigation potential, which is, however, unexploited at the moment due to high mitigation costs or other barriers, and or where the technologies needed for exploring these, for exploiting these mitigation potentials is not available or not accessible here. So this would lead us, in particular, it's particularly relevant for international offsets, where you would like to the offset activities to focus on high-hanging fruits, so to speak, and not the low-cost offset or low-cost abatement options. And this is a significant change in comparison to previous pre-2020 offset approaches, I think. In practice, what could this mean in practice is that for the offset use side, the power sector, for instance, could be excluded from being allowed to use offsets. So it could be excluded from the offset program. And on the offset generation side, you could also exclude, for instance, large-scale renewables in emerging economies. Of course, this are only two examples, and what we did now is we looked at these factors and combined this, of course, with other political economy components and other factors in order to arrive at a systematic evaluation. And that's what we're doing now in this research project funded by UBA. We're now looking into selected sectors and applying these parameters to these sectors. Well, what are the key observations we have that can be drawn from this? Next slide, please. There. Well, I think what is really key here to see is that international offsets are currently confronted with a double challenge. So first, the bottom-up nature of the Paris Agreement makes it more difficult to ensure environmental integrity, while at the same time, the ambition-raising requirement adds an additional layer of complexity. So it's really a double challenge here. In this situation, success factors are a useful tool. They can guide the selection of sectors and jurisdictions, and they can also inform the design of offset programs. As you might have seen, some of the success factors that I have shown previously, they are dynamic in nature. For instance, the mitigation costs or technical mitigation potentials. So in order to capture this dynamic nature, they could be integrated into specific design features of offset programs, such as dynamic baselines, for instance. Also, in particular, one thing that is key here is for international offsets is that the role of host country governments will have to be much stronger in the future. So it's really in order to find the sweet spot, the added value that offsets can bring. It will be key to involve host country governance and also to strengthen international cooperation and exchange. So with this, I'm looking forward to your questions and discussion today. On the next slide, you can see a link to the UBA website where the report from this project will be made available in the future. So it's currently work in progress, but there you can also find information on other projects sponsored by UBA. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Maria and Nico, for these very concise and insightful presentations on different aspects of offsetting, both empirical from the ground as well as a more theoretic outlook on what the challenges are. And yeah, we could really see that this is going to be a very comprehensive exercise. So I guess we're all looking forward to seeing your complete analysis. Now, we will now turn to our panelists. So I'd like colleagues to all of you turn on your cameras now. And while this is taking a few seconds, I'd like to start with a few more general questions and then dive into the details with our panelists. So the first topic would be questions of offset system design. And we're extremely happy to have Judy Meltzer on the panel here now to get the latest news from Canada. So Judy, your country is currently developing the federal greenhouse gas offset system, aiming at promoting reductions and removals from activities that are not covered by carbon pricing or that go beyond legal requirements. Could you shed some light on this process for us in terms of standard setting, quality criteria, the sectoral scope, and so on? What are the priority sectors and why?
Yeah, absolutely. And apologies, I had a little bit of a connection glitch, but hopefully you can hear me now. And thank you very much, both for the previous presentation and from Nicholas and Maria. That was really, really interesting to hear. And we're delighted to have the opportunity to speak a little bit about what's going on in the Canadian context at the federal level. Just for awareness, for those of you who are not necessarily living and breathing the carbon pricing picture in Canada, we now have carbon pricing systems in place in all provinces and territories across the country. There are different systems. The federal carbon pricing system is functioning as a backstop. So, and as I think folks are aware, there's been long-standing both carbon pricing and offset systems in place in different provinces in Canada, including Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta, for example. So it's in the context of that landscape that we are now in the process of developing a national federal carbon offset system. We're still in the preliminary stages. We're moving to have a draft regulations that will establish the system published for consultation later this fall, so this year and later this fall, with final system in place in 2021. And we will be working hard on developing protocols in that context in parallel as we move through this development and consultation process. The primary rationale for developing a federal carbon offset system is to be able to, as you noted, both extend the price signal and incentive to reduce emissions across to different sectors of the economy that are not priced. So as you noted, notably agriculture, forestry, waste, etc. And also from the national perspective, to be able to extend this to different regions, but also to ensure that our regulated industries under the federal emissions trading system, which we call the output-based pricing system, have the opportunity to use offset credits as one of their compliance options. So this gives them flexibility and also provides cost-effective options, particularly as we take into account that our ambition increases over time. So built into the federal approach to pricing carbon pollution minimum national standards for stringency for all systems. And these criteria vary a little bit depending on the type of carbon pricing system, because we have a mixture of both direct, hybrid, and cap and trade systems in Canada. But for our own federal system and direct pricing systems, we've got an increase in carbon price. It's currently at $30 a ton, and it's increasing to $50 in 2022. So the role of offsets as a compliance option in that context will be really, really important. I can come back to this point, but I think there are some interesting things going on in the Canadian context with respect to linkages and some fungibility across different offset systems. So if I can take another minute just to speak to those, and I can provide more detail if there's time and interest. We're trying to take advantage of the fact that we've had, carbon pricing and offset systems in place for some time, and notably in Alberta, BC, and Quebec. And the Quebec and California linked system, I think, is well known, so I won't spend time on that. But we've recently established collaborative agreements with our provincial offset programs to be able to recognize eligible credits from their systems within the federal system. And that has taken a lot of kind of operational heavy lifting from my team to put those in place, as well as our provincial partners. And we had a really good foundation for collaboration because of previous work across the federal, provincial, territorial government community in terms of trying to identify what are best practices for federal offset systems and what do we need to take into account when we try and link systems. So probably not surprisingly, a lot of focus was actually just putting in place mechanisms to ensure that there was good information exchange and really mitigate the risk of any double counting, so that a credit that was used in the federal system, for example, from the eligible provincial system, was not used for any other purpose. So really making sure that the systems that we're both developing and that are in place maintain a really high level of environmental integrity, so that additionality, verifiability, quantified, unique reductions. So that's been a really kind of key focus recently, and we've got agreements in place with 2 provinces. So I'm probably giving a little bit too much of the sort of weedy detail of what's going on in the Canadian domestic context, but I do think that the experience of linking systems, that's something that we've been working hard on for the past year and have recently been able to realize, and our system's still in progress, might provide an interesting example for other jurisdictions. So I'll pause there and happy to elaborate on any part of that.
It's great. Thanks very much, Judy. And this is actually quite a lot of really rich information, which I guess is really useful for a lot of attendees. Yeah, I hope we'll have the chance to come back to a few details later on during the session. I would now like to turn to Martin Haschen and to the EU experience. The EU is currently reserved towards using international offsets, but has a long-standing experience with both design and operation of an emissions trading system, including offsetting, at least in the past. And back then, you chose an international standard, the Kyoto mechanisms, but then added additional restrictions over time. For example, the industrial gas projects restrictions. So against the background of what we just heard, Martin, what would be your lessons in terms of sectoral coverage, offset quality, and robust governance? Martin.
Okay. Yes. First of all, thank you very much for the excellent presentations and the interesting debate. And thank you for inviting me here. Bea, my boss, sends her apologies. Yeah, I think it's right to say that the European Union has been somewhat cautious about offsetting in recent years, and that's based on some sort of experience. So I'll try and explain the headlines of that. Way back in 2005, I was in fact involved in our exercise to link the emissions trading scheme, a capped environment, to the CDM, an international mechanism for offsetting in an uncapped environment. And at the time, one of the major discussions we had was whether there should be a cap on the amount that might be bought, with different views as to exactly what the balance of demand and supply would be, exactly how much flexibility might be needed. And there was a compromise on that led to a rather loose cap. And then over time, I think experience suggested that the mechanism was far more successful than some people thought, and generated quite a lot of units for use within the ETS. And in that sense was a success. A lot of money was sent to invest in projects around the world and demonstrate that carbon pricing can work. But in another sense, because it depressed prices, this was in part responsible for some of the depressed prices we saw and the surpluses we saw, called into question the effectiveness of the system overall. So that's a bit of background. You then had particular controversies over, you mentioned the industrial gas projects, where I think the issue there was that the levels of allocation to these projects were such that there were enormous windfall profits, some of them captured in public funds, but all of these projects really in very small parts of the world, or a very limited number of countries and a limited number of projects. So you saw that most of the investment was going into a sector where the costs of abatement were relatively cheap and in a very narrow area. So that caused a particular sort of controversy. And then you had ongoing discussions over the additionalities of projects, where there were continual allegations that projects were essentially things that would have happened anyway. So over time, I think we withdrew from different classes of projects in relation to the efficiency and the additionality complaints, but also in a political perspective, because we wanted to concentrate on our own domestic emission reductions. And I think that's an important point to raise. I think it's there in some of your presentations, or the division between the two presentations. There are a range of problems that we saw with the offsetting mechanisms that we participated in the past, which we don't think are solved necessarily in the CDM. But looking to the future, where carbon neutrality is a shared goal of all countries, and is increasingly a goal of corporate actors, the question is whether offsetting is designed in a way that can meet carbon neutrality goals. And that, I think, was raised in your presentation. But we have some considerable doubts that the current standards for offsetting deliver on the sorts of things we would need to see to get us towards carbon neutrality. So at the moment, for those that are not aware, we're discussing raising our target, and my institution has a proposal to raise our NDC target for 2030 to 55%. We have a shared objective of getting to carbon neutrality by 2050, and everything is viewed through that lens. So it's a domestic 55% proposal, and because that's where we think we as Europe need to be as a continent to contribute to the overall global objective. And that's the lens in which we're looking at it. In the international negotiations, where I'm part of those negotiations, we're also looking at this international system design. And there are at least three things that we think need to be reflected in the design of international markets, but offsetting specifically going forward. One is the idea that this isn't a zero-sum game anymore. And firstly, that means that there needs to be accounting, which I think both in compliance and in voluntary markets is challenging. There needs to be a system for avoidance of double counting, which has not traditionally applied to all of the offset systems that one has seen. The second issue, which is less well known and equally challenging, is that the reference levels, or the baselines for offset systems, are quite often set at improvements on business as usual. So if you improve on what is projected to be business as usual, you will get an emission reduction. And that mathematically is inconsistent both with national targets, but also with the longer term trajectory to carbon neutrality. So we think that the Article 6.4 mechanism, for instance, needs to have changes to baseline methodologies to deliver. And then finally, in a kind of a bigger framing, as we globally move towards carbon neutrality, there will be a shift from emission reductions into removals. And that brings us to a range of complicated issues, where we are on our own trajectories of carbon neutrality, where we need to end up, what the balance of emissions and removals should be, and how in a market design and in an offset system, one can arrange things so that the supply of emission reductions dries up, because the emission reductions should no longer be available. We should be right down the base emissions in a carbon neutrality scenario, and how do we organize over time the transition from a balance between emissions that are offset with emission reductions to emissions that are offset with removals. So, of course, within our own domestic system, we're looking at how flexibilities within the EU to meet our carbon neutrality target, and particularly the role of removals in delivering on a carbon neutrality goal in the medium term. So I hope I addressed some of the questions that you put in my direction, but I just wanted to lay out how we framed the discussion on offsetting.
Yes, great. Thanks, Martin, for these insights. And yeah, I guess the EU is quite a good example of a learning system, even if the world has changed a lot since the times of the Linking Directive and the CDM boom times. Yeah, thanks for also pointing to 2050, which is something that we'd like to come back to later here during the discussion. Now I'd like to turn to Felipe, yeah, we've heard a lot about safeguarding integrity and offset quality here now for good reasons. So this brings us to the San Jose principles that your country initiated. And if you could briefly give us a little bit of background, maybe most of us are informed, but if you could give a glance on the inside, what was your motivation behind this initiative, and how do you think we can get from more generic principles to the level of implementation? And do you see perhaps interrelations between the national and the regional systems that we touched upon here? You need to unmute.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry, my computer took a second. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's fine. We hear you.
Okay. So thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for those very interesting initial presentations, and to Martin for his comments. So I think the basic framing, and this has been the basic framing, I would argue, for Costa Rica in general, when discussing market mechanisms, is that we treat them a little bit like we treat fire, I would argue. They are extremely powerful and extremely relevant, but have to be handled with care lest you wind up destroying what you are trying to work with. And so we've always felt that robust rules and ensuring that ambition was at the very center of the design of these mechanisms was a principle that had to be explicitly held out, right? We believe that markets can definitely help deliver ambition, but we strongly challenge the notion that markets in and of themselves help deliver ambition in any way, shape, or form. And so you have to go beyond that zero-sum game that was described a while ago if you want to deliver that. And I would argue that that is a sentiment shared by a good chunk of countries in the Article 6 negotiations, and by a good swath of practitioners in this field. Before I joined the negotiations, I used to be a CDM project developer, so I know the pain quite personally of the entire process and the ups and downs. And I had a few choice words for Martin when he was one of the powers that be in that space. I recognize the difficulties, right? But if we are going to do better, and I think we all recognize we have to do better, then we hoped, we thought, we still think that having a definition of ambition, a sort of set of principles that we can agree on, at least in principle, right? And build from there was a useful way to help build momentum, positive momentum. And I still think that that's the case. In a lot of spaces, and I would argue that is the case in the Article 6 space, some of the voices for no, or some of what I would tend to refer to as negative voices, or voices that I disagree with, tend to be very loud, and they tend to sometimes sound like a lot more of, like a bigger percentage of the room than they tend to be, I would argue. And that is the case, I think, quite often. And so having a space where we have an ambitiously framed conversation felt like a good way to promote ambition, like a good way to help the presidencies land a high ambition text, because we fundamentally believe that this has to happen within the multilateral system. We fundamentally believe that this being a global problem requires a globally organized solution, and especially in this sort of space, right? We need rules that maintain coherent accounting, because we have a single planet and a single atmosphere. And so being clever in our accounting systems is not really going to help us. We can have this world where we've all been able to achieve net zero and we all get to claim we're great, and temperatures continue to rise and the oceans continue to acidify and things continue to get worse and worse, especially for those that are most vulnerable. So we basically, that was the core motivation. And so in pre-COP, through the support of my minister back then, my current minister, Andrea Mesa, used to be my director of climate change. My current minister has moved on and is now working with the Green Environment Fund. But then I guess this is all a family affair to some degree. The climate change directorate and the climate change team, with again the support of our minister, convened a group of high-level actors from countries that shared similar views and that didn't necessarily agree on absolutely everything, but again, in principle, shared views on the importance of ambition and integrity on these things. A lot of them had been heard to at pre-COP in these initial conversations, and so a conversation grew around those, and the set of principles, what is now the sponsor principles, were sort of hammered out at that pre-COP conversation. But because we were close to COP and because we wanted to give space for the presidency to sort of roll out its approach, at the end they were not announced at pre-COP. But we continued to sort of talk in that group and try to find ways to build ambition and to work together. And I think that group is particularly relevant because it crosses every possible divide, I think, or almost every possible divide, right? You have big developed countries and you have literally LDCs. You have from, I think, every continent. You cross every possible divide. So that conversation continued to mature. And eventually in the wee hours of Madrid, we came to a conclusion, I think, that we had to help, we had to deliver that push. We had to have that voice to say, we need an outcome. We absolutely need an outcome, but that outcome has to be a high ambition outcome. And so the principles were released very much trying to help give that push. And we hope that they continue to give that push, because now in the circumstances that we're in, the horrible circumstances that we're in, with this delay in the negotiations and with this slowing down, there is of course a potential to cool down, right? For the gains that we made and for the hard-fought gains that we made and that we have made, and there were gains in Madrid, very important gains in Madrid that we have to safeguard. It's important to make sure that we keep momentum and that we keep building momentum to deliver on that mandate, and we hope that that's something that the principles will continue to do and that principal countries will continue to do.
Right, great. Thank you, Felipe, for making this really strong point for integrity and for quality. Let me, although we're running a little bit behind schedule, let me come back to the Canadian situation, because I'd like to dive a little bit more into policy level and interaction. Judy, you mentioned the differences between the federal and the provincial level, and I guess this is especially important in terms of carbon accounting and offset use. You pointed to that earlier on. Could you shed some light and on this process and some lessons on how you enable robust accounting between provinces, and do you think that this can also inform the international level?
Thanks very much for that question, and for the points that have been raised by my colleagues. And before I respond to that, I just want to reiterate just really some of the points that and considerations that have been raised really resonate as we think about the federal system. And I will caveat it and say that we're still in the relatively early stages of development, although we've done a lot of consultation. For us, as we think about the federal system and whether it's about how to recognize credits from other jurisdictions, in this case provinces, or in development of our own protocols and crediting systems, you know, the kind of the primacy of ensuring environmental integrity, ensuring additionality is really forefront for us, because these are substituting for industrial emissions. And I should note that where the federal pricing system applies, we've got two parts to it. There's a fuel charge, which doesn't have the compliance flexibility of offsets, so it's a direct carbon price on fossil fuels. So offsets are being used in the context of our emissions trading system for emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries, different opportunities in terms of abatements at different costs. So it's really, so we are kind of, I think, share the same considerations and concerns as we move forward in the space. To your question, yeah, I do think, I mean, I'm probably a little bit biased, but I think me and our team as a whole think that the Canadian context is serving as a really interesting example, and will continue to do so, hopefully. You know, we do have a really great example of early well-integrated linked systems across jurisdictions with Canada and with California and Quebec. But what's our focus right now on the federal side is really trying to make sure that we can have you know, excellent processes in place. And I know I keep coming back to that kind of operational piece of it, but it's really at the heart of it is having you know, detailed memoranda of understanding between different levels of government. In this case, we have those in place with British Columbia and Alberta, to ensure that you know, we are able to maintain the rigor that's required for recognizing offsets with all the advantages and risks that may bring, as people have pointed to, in our industrial emissions trading system. And you know, it's that simple. How do systems communicate with each other? What types of processes do you have in place to redress when issues arise? You know, how does the timing of you know, each of the respective systems sort of work together? And it's in those very detailed operational steps that ensure that information is shared, and ultimately that one credit is eligible, so meets the criteria that we need to see into the federal context. And that criteria, for example, to give one example, is that, you know, we won't recognize credits from projects unless they've started after January 1st, 2017. That's when the federal approach on pricing and the Pan-Canadian framework, our national roadmap on climate action, was announced. So it's an important sort of time marker. Again, going back to that point of ensuring that what we're talking about is additional reductions. So ensuring that the sort of range of criteria that we need to see are met, ensuring that when a credit is used from a different system in the federal system, that we have confidence that it's only being used once. So again, I mean, I think, you know, we're treading on ground that people are very aware of, but I think the work between concept and actually operationalizing it, I think there are some really great examples. And, you know, we have a lot of information on our website, and I'm happy to share the links after, but we've got papers up that outline the detail of the design of the federal system that we're contemplating. But also that give details about how and what we recognize in our provincial partner systems. So yeah, okay. I'll just keep emphasizing that point about the operational details matter.
Right. Okay, sorry, Judy, I have to interrupt here because we're running out of time. It's really a lot of interesting details, and yeah, we'll hopefully find the space to dive into this somewhere at a different occasion. Now, I'll be opening up the floor now to the questions from the Q&A, and I have one question here, a little bit of a general question to Maria. Offsets do not have a good reputation with NGOs and front-running companies. Why is that, and what is your perspective how to avoid that offsets are used for greenwashing? Maria, have you a short answer to this?
Okay, so I think partly it's actually the history of offsets. The amount of times I've seen Fiona Harvey's 2007 article on cowboy carbon offsetters. And that's a very important history that a lot of people remember, and the loss of trust on that offsets actually represent real additional verifiable emission reductions that you can substantiate is very important. And then the question is now how a lot has happened in the past 15 years on actually ensuring offset governance. And then the question will be, does the current offset governance standards actually uphold to environmental integrity in a way that we can measure? And partly that goes back into this notion of actually having robust governance, robust systems in place, especially with dynamic crediting baselines and to ensure what is additional. The way I would say to ensure that offsets aren't just greenwashing goes back into, especially since we're talking about compliance here, policymakers need to design a compliance system that sends a strong carbon price signal that cannot be compromised to any external shock. With offsets themselves, it has to be qualitative and quantitative restrictions that shows the compliance actor that they cannot just rely on offsets, but that they have to reduce their own emissions, and that incentive comes from a strong carbon price signal. And we have the credibility that the only offsets that are allowed are ones that have high environmental integrity and potentially have a premium on sustainable development. That actually ensures not just about offsets, but the entire notion of raising ambition, that you're driving a strong signal to reduce emissions within the compliance scheme, and you create incentives to reduce emissions outside of it.
Great, thanks, Maria. Then the next question goes out to Nico. It's a question on accounting. So could you, Nico, draw out the distinction between emission reductions with or without corresponding adjustments? And how does that affect the approaches to offset design? It's a little more technical, but I'm still asking you to find a brief answer if possible.
A brief answer, I'll try to. Well, thanks for the question, first of all. Well, the corresponding adjustment is a key requirement for offsets, in particular in the internet, if offsets are used for compliance purposes. So I would ask back, where could offsets be used without having corresponding adjustments? There are some proponents of an architecture within the voluntary carbon market who say they would, at least for some time, not require corresponding adjustments to be made because of the challenges that voluntary carbon market participants encounter in developing countries in particular. However, I think that we should not be the path we should go. So really corresponding adjustments should be a key element of all credits, whether they're used within or within the voluntary or the compliance market. That is a key, from my perspective, environmental integrity requirement, and it's really key for upholding environmental integrity of the system. And I think also there is this, I think Maria touched upon this, there was a loss of trust in the past, and I think this is the big risk if we're running into, if we accept credits to be issued without having, without these being backed by corresponding adjustments in the countries where they have been generated. So yeah, that's my take on this.
Great, thanks for being so concise. Yeah, I guess this would even be the last question which we can actually take. It goes out to the EU. Martin, the EU, when looking at the potential use of removals in the future, are they looking at nature-based solutions or technological solutions? This is a question from the floor.
I'm not technically proficient. Yeah, I think, first of all, in terms of what we need to get to carbon neutrality, I think we're looking at all solutions, right? So I don't think we have a particular technological bias or sectoral bias. What disturbs me a little bit in the offsetting discussion is that my concern about it is that, like all subsidies, there's an amount of conservativeness. Once one has indicated that one is going to subsidize an emission reduction, which essentially is what an offsetting system does, one creates a disincentive to progression. And at the moment, what we're seeing, and I think it's a real problem, whether it's compliance markets internationally or voluntary markets, is that the challenge of carbon neutrality, where offset is no longer beyond or outside targets. Offsetting has to happen within the whole scope of carbon neutrality. We've one planet and one set of emissions to deal with and one set of removals to deal with. So there's no beyond and there's no outside. And our offset systems seem to be, and those seem to be resistant to addressing these issues like accounting and corresponding adjustment, which applies not only to compliance markets, but I think increasingly to voluntary markets where they are contributing to compliance goals. And not only, we haven't even started to explore the issue that I mentioned around ambition, that the baselines themselves are crediting inconsistent. So for me, sorry for hijacking the question, but we have a real challenge, I think, in looking at what the demands of carbon neutrality and being within the scope of a target and not beyond the scope of a target means for offsetting. And I don't think we've begun to address it, which is why I welcome the research very much, because I think it starts to raise some of those points. But we've got no particular bugbear about how things should work. I do think the removals market is complicated politically, because in 2050, that's the only thing that we will be looking at, right? Because we will have got rid of all the emissions that we. And so there could be a green rush or a gold rush or a nature-based solution rush for those outcomes. But we're a long way from there.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, for these really important thoughts. And this reminds me of a discussion we just had this morning. And I guess, yeah, the world in 2050 is going to look far different from what we know now, and research and also deployment from technologies will have really changed. And so for now, we cannot exactly say what kinds of options we will actually have then. Now, as usual, time is over too quickly. Thank you all very much for this very lively discussion. I would now, without further ado, turn to Carsten Kaschunke of UBA, who's going to summarize the main takeaways for us here now. Carsten, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Christoph. Well, first of all, I have to thank for the presenters for their two very interesting presentations, and of course to all of our three panelists, which provided us with valuable insights to the Canadian system, which at the federal level are constructing now a new approach to the use of offsets in close linkage to a federal compliance system, which of course needs high quality standards and a lot of communication between the different levels of administrations. When I hear this, working since many years for the federal administration, I can be happy that in Germany we have the carbon market issue centralized at the federal level. So we are, at least in this case, quite lucky. Well, we heard from Martin Heschen from the European Commission the experiences from the past when the EU ETS was linked to the CDM and the joint implementation in the first three crediting periods, the first trading periods of the EU ETS, and now in the fourth, there is, due to the experience, no linkage to offsets, but indeed we learned that taking into account the new targets, there will be a new assessment regarding the effect which offsets, especially offsets not generated from emission reductions but from removals, may have with a view to climate neutrality, which is the aim for the European Union in the next years. And we heard from Felipe from Costa Rica the effects, how the push to the increase of quality of standards and for raising emissions, to assure the raise of emissions can be given by small nations like Costa Rica into the process of the COP last year, when at the pre-COP a group of like-minded countries was gathered to build up the San Jose principles and to join behind the San Jose principles in the last days of the COP in Madrid. And of course, this initiative will continue, and there will be further. They will have further effects in the run-up to the next COP in Glasgow for sure. Yes, and I think in the last round the questions to Maria and to Nico, dealing with the risk of bad reputation for greenwashing. They showed us clearly that high standards and certain limits and restrictions regarding the quality and the quantity are key if offset system should be will be linked to a compliance system. So the most important thing to avoid double counting would be a application of corresponding adjustments for all the offsets used, and that's, I think, was quite clear to be one of the key success factors for the application of offsets together with a compliance system to increase emission and to come forward regarding our climate mitigation targets. Thank you. That's from my part. I want to hand over to Christoph Beck. Thank you.
Thank you. I think with that, we can finish our session, How to Raise Ambition Through Carbon Offsetting. Please check the website as we will be posting this recording, and thank you again for joining us. Bye-bye.